Hello and welcome to Medieval Lulls, a close reading series from the London Review of Books. I'm Irina Dumitrescu.
And I'm Mary Wellesley.
And we are writers, literary historians, and contributors to the paper. In this series, we are asking, was the Middle Ages funny? We're taking a tour through texts both familiar and unfamiliar, in Latin, English, and other European vernacular languages, and hunting for laughter and jest in the textual remains of the past. In our last episode, we looked at a wildly popular scatological dialogue that asked, can people be taught to be wise and polite, or will their baser nature always win out? Our poem for today is also concerned with manners, this time featuring that hero of medieval romance we all know so well, Sir Gawain. A rollicking side quest featuring gigantic feasts, weird tests of politeness, and what could be a medieval fetish scene. This is Sir Gawain and the Carle of Carlisle. Okay, Mary, tell us a little bit about this poem. Where do we have it from? Where is it?
So it's a Middle English romance. We've encountered romance before in other series, but basically a romance is a kind of, I would say, medium-length narrative poem, generally about the kind of exploits of usually noble characters. There's often kind of fighting and sometimes a little bit of sexual intrigue, wonderful description of feasts. You know, it's describing a kind of idealized, often aristocratic world. But we get the sense from some of the manuscript evidence that actually the readers of this were not necessarily aristocrats. It's a sort of genre that appeals to quite a wide audience. This particular tale is uniquely preserved in a manuscript from the West Midlands. It's in a kind of West Midland dialect. It looks like the scribal dialect, so the dialect of the scribe who copied the only manuscript is kind of Cheshire or Shropshire. And it's describing very roughly that sort of part of the world. It's describing kind of Wales up to Cumbria, basically, which is very similar. If people know Gawain and the Greene Knight, will know that the kind of geographical area that's described in Gawain and the Greene Knight is something very similar. There we have reference to Anglesey, North Wales, and then, you know, the Wirral and sort of roughly that area. The manuscript is from about 1460 or a little bit later. It's a manuscript in the National Library of Wales in Aberystwyth. The manuscript itself is a kind of typical medieval miscellany. So I've definitely said this before, but I think it's worth saying again. Medieval manuscripts are a bit like a modern bookshelf rather than a modern book. So they are these sometimes random collections of things put together for simple practical reasons. It's easy to have one single accessible book which has got, you know, lyrics, Christmas carols, texts about the weather. There's a chronicle, there's some agricultural texts, there's some botanical stuff, there's devotional, there's moral, there's instructional, there's a saint's life, and also these kind of more obviously entertaining texts like these romances. And this particular romance is a poem. It's in 12-line tale rhyme stanzas.
And it's quite short, actually. It's only around 600 lines, but it packs a lot of action in those lines. So maybe we should talk a little bit about the story. What actually happens in this
this so
romance?
we're in the court of King Arthur. Very well-known sort of setting for a lot of Middle English romance, well, a huge amount of medieval literature. King Arthur is this legendary king. He's surrounded by all of his knights. We're in Wales, we're in Cardiff, and Arthur and his knights decide to go hunting. And we get this kind of list of each of the knights, and they're kind of introduced. We've got Gawain, Sir Kay. We've got a bishop called Bishop Baldwin, who doesn't behave in a very bishopy sort of a way. And they're each described. Anyway, they're out on this hunt, and they've gone quite a long way from home, and it's quite late, and it seems like they're not going to get back in time. And somehow they've managed to make it from Cardiff to Cumbria, to the Inglewood Forest. Well,
there's a mist. There's a hazy mist.
There's a mist, and they've managed to get all the way to Cumbria. So then they arrive at this castle, And they think, well, we must go and we'll knock at the door and we'll ask to be let in and given a bed for the night.
Yeah, and it's kind of, interesting. Already you start to see the difference in behavior between the three of them. So Sir Kay is always the angry one in Arthurian romance. This is just he's a stock figure all along, and he's basically quite rude, and he says he will demand lodging. And Bishop Baldwin seems to have the same idea, that they're going to force their way in and have a place to stay.
They're kind of meatheads, right?
Yeah. And Gawain basically says, no, I was hoping to be polite and just ask for it, So already there's a sense that they behave differently. And Gawain, we'll talk at greater length about the characterization of Gawain, but he's described as very buff, very muscular, but meek as a maid. So already we have a slightly different figure in Gawain here. He's quite manly, but he's also kind of feminine in a funny sort of way, and that's going to play out through the rest of the plot.
So they arrive at this castle, and the bishop says, I know who lives here. It's this guy called the Carle of Carlisle. And Carl here is probably a bit like Churl. It's a Norse name, but basically it's indicating that this is a person who is, although he has this big castle, he's not a noble figure, right? He's not an aristocrat. So they knock on the door, and they knock so hard it seems like the knocker is actually going to fall off the door. And a porter comes, and it's this kind of wonderful, quite familiar sort of story that we get in a lot of medieval literature, where these kind of unknown figures come to the door, and the porter looks at them and says, I can tell just by looking at you that you guys must be noble, you're noble knights. But he says, I don't think you should ask to stay here because bad stuff will happen to you if you stay here. And then the meatheads are like, shut up, we're coming in. And so the porter then goes back to the Carl, who's the host, the owner of the castle, and says, there are some knights at the door, and he says, we'll let them in. And then you have this amazing scene where they enter this great hall, and they see this huge man. He's like a giant, and he's surrounded by these kind of wild animals. It says he has a wild bull and a lethal boar and a lion and a huge bear, and they're all kind of like his pets.
His whelps.
Yeah, they're described as his whelpus, his whelps, and they all kind of jump up as if they're going to attack the newcomers, the guests, and he tells them, lie down, kind of calls them to heel. So already we have a sense of this character who is so powerful that he's able to keep kind of wild beasts as pets, right? And clearly something's not right here.
He does allow them in, and they have a huge supper. And really, the Carl has these cups that are immense. So they're drinking a lot. There has something almost otherworldly, a little bit Old Norse about it. And then the bishop goes to check on his horse, where there's a little foal eating next to it. And the bishop puts him out of the shed and basically complains about the foal eating with his palfrey. And the Carl comes out immediately and hits the bishop. He gives him a big buffet for treating his foal so badly. The same thing happens with Sir Kay. Sir Kay goes out, sees the foal, drives him out, hits him on the back, and the Carl comes and strikes him as well. And he says, evil-taught knights, I shall teach thee before you go away some of my courtesy. Right? So it's playing off of this idea of the knights being technically more courteous, the Carl having no courtesy because he's just a churlish rustic man, but the knights are behaving quite rudely at this point to the foal. And then Gawain goes out, and Gawain is about to check on his horse, but it started raining at this point, and the poor foal is outside. And Gawain gently leads the foal inside and even puts his mantle on the animal to protect it from the rain. And he says, to have some food, it's your master's hay. that's here anyway. So Gawain recognizes that it's the Carle's feed that their horses are eating. There's no reason why the Carle's own horse shouldn't eat there as well. And the Carle is very moved by this, and he comes out and basically just thanks him over and over again for being so kind to the foal. So there's a test of behavior that happens naturally at this point. But then the Carle tests Gawain a little further, right?
So then they come back inside, and the Carle says, sit, you must eat. And then he says, and now, fellows, you must do my bidding. And he takes a spear in his hand, and he gives it to Gawain, and he says, you must throw this and try to hit me in the face. I'm 385. And don't worry, even if you throw me right against the wall, you won't do me any harm. So Gawain is it's then the text in this kind of like wonderful understated way says, Sir Gawain was a glad man with that. So Sir Gawain was good humoured about that. It's a completely bizarre request from your host, and yet Gawain he is a pillar of courtesy. Of course, this is what his host has asked, and so of course this is what he must do. If you enjoy hearing about medieval literature, you can listen to our full 12-episode series, Medieval Beginnings, right now as part of the LRB's Close Readings podcast subscription. Sign up directly in Apple Podcasts or in other podcast apps. There are links for these below.